Holy moly, guys. Welcome back to the Heal with Kat podcast. My name is Kat and I am your host, and welcome to the mind-blowing boundaries and codependency episode with my new friend Barb, who is going to blow your mind today, okay? This is going to be an incredible conversation for women specifically who struggle with boundaries and codependency that come from deeply enmeshed families. And Barb is full of life experience, knowledge, wisdom, and she is even a coach, a boundaries coach. And I'm literally thinking about working with her because it was so profound. In fact, the whole time on the episode, she was talking to me and I was trying so hard to be present, but I have all these things going through my head and I was like, oh my God, this is landing and this is landing and this is landing. It's just going to be one of those episodes that completely fills you up. And it's like you're in a coaching session with Barb for like an hour and 10 minutes. It's just amazing. You guys are going to love it. I don't want to get too into the weeds because I really want you to just hear the episode and start to take in Barb's wisdom and knowledge. But I'll tell you a little bit about who Barb is so you have a little backstory on our guest this week. Barb Nangle is a boundaries coach, speaker, and the founder and CEO of Higher Power Coaching and Consulting, LLC, and the host of the podcast Fragmented to Whole Life Lessons from 12-Step Recovery. In 2015, at the age of 52, after decades of therapy and tons of self-help work in a variety of areas, Barb found herself in 12-Step Recovery. She's been in 2 such fellowships since then and has changed deeply and profoundly as a result. As a former addict and people-pleasing rescuer, that hits. She empowers people to thrive and take more control over their personal and professional lives by coaching them to build healthy boundaries. She works with organizations in helping professions as well as women entrepreneurs to avoid burnout and reduce turnover. Her specialty is working with professional women who say yes when they really want to say no and neglect themselves because they're focused on others. How many of us are raising our hands, okay? It's going to be such a good episode. And I just want to say, hold yourself with love in this episode. What I love about Barb is that she is wholesome, she's down to earth, and she has no expectations for anyone. She comes from lived experience of years of her suffering and finding difficulty in enmeshment and codependency and boundaries. And she will understand you. I mean, I felt so seen. So come into this episode with an open mind, an open heart, grab a journal, a pen, maybe grab your phone, take some notes. And don't forget to visit the links in the show notes below to work with Barb. I will probably see you there. Enjoy this week's episode. It's going to blow your freaking mind. Barb, welcome to the Heal with Kat podcast. I am so ready for our conversation today. Thank you.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, I'm so excited. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, we were just chatting a little bit before we started recording about a lot of really potent topics that I think a lot of people really need permission to speak about, hear about, and hear people's stories with it. So I would love to just jump right in and have you tell me and the audience your story and how you got set on this journey.
Yeah, so I will start in 2015 when I was 52. I hit a codependent bottom. I'm assuming that your audience knows what the word codependent means. I didn't, which is kind of shocking because I had been in therapy since I was 15. So it's like 37 years of almost continuous therapy. I read a gajillion self-help books. I did workshops and workbooks and work groups and retreats and spiritual, like you name all the things. And I had never heard of this word. And the way that I think of all that stuff that I did before Kat was like that stuff scratched the surface of the iceberg of my life, and recovery melted the iceberg of my life. So I didn't say this. I landed in 12-step recovery because of the codependent bottom. And I think that the reason that the recovery melted the iceberg of my life is partly because the 12 steps of recovery are an amazing technology, and partly because I ended up doing trauma recovery, which I didn't know that I had. I didn't know I had intergenerational family dysfunction. I didn't know I had relational childhood trauma or any of that stuff. But I started by going to Codependence Anonymous. And I remember very early on saying to someone as I got into Coda, I feel like I need to be reparented, but I thought I'd made that term up. I didn't know it was a thing, but I also felt a sense of relief very quickly. And I think partly it was knowing I have this label, codependence. There's like a It's almost like a syndrome of things that started to make sense. And then also that there was a recovery program, that there were other people like me, that there was hope. But I remember saying, I think I need to, like, basically go back to the beginning. I need to be reparented. Well, 6 weeks into my journey in Coda, I went away to go visit a couple of friends, one of whom had been in Alcoholics Anonymous for like 10 years at that point. And she had always just raved about how her life was revolutionized. So I was like, oh, you're going to love this. I'm going to Codependence Anonymous. She was like, this is great. Let's see if we can find a CODA meeting while you're here. And she couldn't, but she found an ACA meeting, which I knew of as ACOA. And as long as I can remember, I had heard of adult children of alcoholics. I now know it's actually adult children of alcoholics and dysfunctional families. I didn't hear the and dysfunctional families part. So when she said, let's go to this meeting, I thought, I don't qualify for that, but I'll go for you. And I walk in, and in the opening readings, they said, we reparent ourselves. And I was like, what? By the way, can I swear on this show?
Yeah,
I tend to swear.
totally,
Okay.
totally.
So I was like, holy shit. And then they read the list of the 14 traits of an adult child, which is affectionately called the laundry list. And initially, I thought I had 7 of those traits. I actually have 13 because I was in such denial, which is a huge part of the recovery, is to come out of denial. Well, my friend tells me I sobbed the whole meeting. I don't remember that. I bought the literature. I came home to New Haven, Connecticut. I started going to ACA. A women's meeting started a few weeks after that. So I started going to a second ACA meeting. And then I got into a group with 3 other women to actually go through the 12-step workbook and do the 12 steps, and started really seeing and feeling some major, major recovery in ways that I was like, oh my God, this is what happened. This is what happened. This is what happened. I didn't know something, quote, happened to me, but I felt like I'm reading the literature. I'm like, were they filming the inside of my head? It was just crazy. And a year into that, I decided to let go of CODA because it was maybe a 75% fit, whereas ACA was 100% fit. And that turned out to be divinely inspired because one of the women that I was in the step group with had started going to Overeaters Anonymous, had started talking about her thinking and behavior around food, especially sugar. And I was like, oh my God. And it wasn't, oh my God, what she was doing. It was that she was talking about it. I was like, oh my God, I do that. So she was trying to gently get me to go. So I went to a workshop with her and I'm like, oh my God, I'm a compulsive overeater. So I joined Overeaters Anonymous and I did the 12 steps in that program too. I'm now down over 100 pounds from my top weight. And what I know now, Kat, is that the codependence, the food, the many years of drinking abusively, and the many years of smoking bales of weed were about trauma. Now, when I was in high school and I was a pothead, I thought I was cool. Like, I'm cool. Now I look back and I'm like, no, I was traumatized. That was what was going on. And so I think of my core wound as codependence. And boundaries are essentially the antidote to codependence. And so I learned how to build healthy boundaries in this sort of like meandering haphazard path through the 12 steps of recovery in my first maybe 2 to 3 years. And when I had really well established boundaries, I was like, wow, this is amazing. Like my life is so completely different. So I started reading about boundaries, and it helped me retroactively understand like what was going on in terms of before and after. But as I was reading, it was a bunch of words, and I've learned that I'm a pretty visual person. So this explains why I was started drawing these images, like of what that sort of like looked like to me in terms of boundaries. Well, those drawings turned into handouts, which turned into a workbook, which is now the spine of my boundaries coaching program. So I created an accelerated process so that people can learn how to build healthy boundaries in a matter of weeks or months rather than years, and through a very structured process instead of some haphazard path like I did. But that happened a few years later. So when I landed in recovery, I was working full time at Yale University. I was a program coordinator for urban education, prevention, and policy research. And my first 2.5 years I was in recovery, I was still there. Then I got laid off. And through a series of serendipitous events, started my own business, started my podcast, which is called Fragmented to Whole: Life Lessons from 12-Step Recovery. And I did that not thinking it would have anything to do with my business. It was really about getting all of this wisdom from 12-step recovery out into the world. So I've been doing that for over 5.5 years. I have about to record my 296th episode.
Oh, congratulations.
And thank you. It turns out the podcast is the number one way I get clients. But when I started, I was just sort of like generally coaching. And then as I got more into the world of entrepreneurship, I realized you have to have a niche, because if you're trying to coach everybody, you are coaching nobody.
Yeah.
And so it just made sense for me to become a boundaries coach, because, they were such a game changer for me. I found I was really good at helping people both in recovery and clients build healthy boundaries. I also come from a lived experience of, I know what it's like to be in my body with no boundaries and to be in my body with healthy boundaries. I can describe the journey, the experience, the emotional experience. I can teach people how to make that journey. I know like what is involved in all that. And, there's so many ways that my life has been improved and impacted. But I think the one that most people really like to hear about is that I am now, for the first time, in my only healthy romantic relationship of my life. So I happen to date men. And so every man I ever dated before my current sweetheart, I thought the pattern was that they were emotionally unavailable, and it was, but the real pattern was codependence. What I learned was not only what I used to think, Kat, was that emotionally unavailable men were attracted to me. This is true. What I didn't see was that I was also attracted to them. Like that I was blind to. And that the reason that attraction was there was because I was emotionally unavailable. It makes sense, because what emotionally available man wants to date an emotionally unavailable woman? So another thing that became clear about the dating is that, and this was subconscious at the time, I only saw this in recovery, that I believed about all my previous relationships that I was responsible for all the good things in those relationships, and whoever he was responsible for all the bad things, which I'm laughing because it's laughable to think that one person is responsible for everything good and one person's responsible for all the bad. Well, anyway, when I was 55, I met my sweetheart when he was 60. We've now been together for over 6 years. It's the first and only healthy romantic relationship I've ever had. He's my person.
Oh.
And, I was with him this morning. We have a very even relationship. We have a schedule, which we sort of fell into, but works for both of us. And we literally switch off who stays over whose house. Every relationship before that, I did 90 to 100% of, I went to them, I accommodated them, I stayed at their house, I made their life easier. I also tried to control their lives too, including what was going on in their houses when I didn't live there. And so there's many gifts that I've gotten as a result of my recovery, both the trauma recovery, the 12-step recovery, the compulsive overeating, the codependent recovery. But I'll stop there because I know I've given you lots of fodder for talking, and I'm sure some of the other stuff will come up. But I could go on forever.
Well, it's just what's so profound about your story is, like you said, it's lived experience. You're teaching from a place of embodiment, which I think so many coaches lack. When coaches and therapists
and therapists specifically, yes. I don't know about coaches, but therapists, yes.
For sure.
They lack it, yeah.
They're not doing their own work around it, then it almost like stunts their ability to evolve with their clients. I went to Coda for a few months back when I was in recovery for my eating disorder, when I was in my early 20s. And I liked it because I found a lot of community. I was like, oh, these people are just like me. But the vulnerability aspect of it was so intense for me, I stopped going because it felt too emotional to be there. Fast forward to during the pandemic, I'm living alone in a studio apartment in San Diego, and I'm divorced, and I'm like, I'm bored. Like I need something to do today. I'm stuck in my apartment. Well, I started going to that same meeting that I went to years before, but I did it online, and I found again that community. And this time I was post-divorce, I was older, and I was willing to do a little bit more work on myself. And I found that Coda was incredibly supportive for community, for the ability to share in a safe place, for people to see and understand you. But I found in my Coda meeting that I was in that we were all codependent on each other. And so
Yeah.
there weren't those healthy boundaries. And I ended up, so for
Mm-hmm.
that reason, I ended up leaving, unfortunately. And I never
Mm-hmm.
made it
Mm-hmm.
into any other 12-step program. But I
Mm-hmm.
do remember working the 12 steps with a sponsor and had a very profound experience in understanding what my inner language was. And in family constellation therapy, we talk about the languages of the family. What are the accepted
Mm-hmm.
ways that we belong and bond with each other? And
Mm-hmm.
codependency is like the number one thing that I see with myself and my clients.
Mm-hmm.
We all don't know how to be close, so we think that being too close to each other is the way that we're supposed to
Right.
do it.
Yeah. Enmeshment, it feels like we think it's intimacy, but it's really enmeshment.
It's
Yes.
really
Yeah.
enmeshment. And then, of
Yeah.
course, that was bleeding into so many different things. I'm lucky I found my partner. He's not codependent at all. And he's like, I want you to have your own life and do your own thing. And at first I was like, do you even love me? And now I'm like, oh, thank you for loving me that way. But I guess
Yeah.
for somebody who's listening who doesn't really understand codependency, because it's kind of this like
Mm-hmm.
buzzword now, how would
Mm-hmm.
you describe it
Mm-hmm.
to someone who's new to
Yeah.
this?
Yeah. I mean, I think at its most basic, it is reliance on that which is outside of ourselves. So it could be feedback from other people. It could be, I need affirmation from other people to believe that I'm worthy. I need you to be okay so that I can be okay. And mostly, I need you to be okay with me to be okay. I need to fix, rescue, and save everything that's going on around me. I need to control things. I mean, I think the typical codependent is someone who is in a relationship with an addict or an alcoholic. So that could be a romantic partner, it could be an adult child, um, or it could be, with a parent as well. But it's our focus is on them. And when I had a hard time in the beginning wrapping my mind around codependence because it is sort of this amorphous kind of thing. And there was a podcast at the time. I don't even know if it's still around. It was called Codependency No More, not Codependent No More by Melody Beattie. This
Right.
was by a guy, and one of his guests was Tyan Dayton. Do you know her?
No.
She's one of the pioneers of the adult child and codependency movement. She's a psychotherapist. She does dramaturgical therapy. She's written a ton of books.
Wow.
Well, she was on his show, and this was literally like my first 6 months. And she said, I've been around since the whole codependency trauma thing came up, and what's happened over time is the research and theory on trauma has advanced beyond that of codependence. And so this would have been in 2015. So it's advanced even further since then.
Yeah.
But what she said was, we now know that codependence is a result of trauma, and here's why. Because when we're in trauma, when we're traumatized, we're in fight or flight mode. So I call it lizard brain, right? And when you're in lizard brain, you can't access your frontal lobe, the human part of the brain, the higher order thinking part of the brain. And that's a problem because the self is an abstract, ever changing concept which lives in the frontal lobe of the brain. So, literally, when you're in fight or flight mode, you can't get to self. So, you must go outside of yourself.
Whoa.
And I was like, oh my God, it was like this giant chunk of understanding fell into place for me because I'm one of those people, I really need to understand something.
Yeah.
I really want to get why this is happening. And so when she said that, I was like, oh, okay, I get it now. And, what just popped into my head, so I'm going to share. I remember one time being in a yoga class with a guy that I was dating, and he was on the other side of the room. I was literally over there. I was not here on my mat in my body. I was over there observing him, observing me, and also observing him. Like, to me, that is the epitome of codependence. I'm literally not even in my own body in a yoga class, which is an embodied practice.
Yeah.
So I was so concerned with other people and what they were doing and thinking that when the idea that I could ask, what do I want or need? I was like, what does that even mean?
Mm-hmm.
I didn't even know what it meant.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not dumb, okay? But I didn't know what it meant to say, what do I want or need here? It was like, huh? Crazy.
It's survival mode in its deepest form, and
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
it's hard. I've found with codependency and boundaries, which I want to talk about as well. I've
Mm-hmm.
found that it's such a deep subconscious language in my own brain that when
Mm-hmm.
therapists, I've been in therapy on and off since I was 5, so I understand that kind of evolution
Mm-hmm.
of therapy. And all the things you're told and they make no sense to you, and you until you live it, you don't get it. And therapists used to just kind of explain my situation and my life and what codependency was and enmeshment, and I would go, you're crazy. There's nothing wrong with my family. I'm the one that's the problem. It's my fault. And so it was like that deeply ingrained in me
Mm-hmm.
until I
Mm-hmm.
learned to become my own person very
Mm-hmm.
slowly, very
Mm-hmm.
slowly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then you start coming back to yourself, coming home to yourself and going, oh, I was never okay with that. And I couldn't even
Mm-hmm.
see that until
Right,
it was
right,
done. It was
right.
like death by 1,000 cuts until finally I was
Yes.
like, oh God, I can't keep doing this anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a really,
Mm-hmm.
I think for me, it's been a very, difficult journey. And
Mm-hmm.
also, when everybody's language in the family system is codependency and you want to step out of that, you feel like the black sheep. And that's why my whole business has been
Mm-hmm.
around black sheep to cycle breaker, because actually the
Mm-hmm.
antidote, like you
Mm-hmm.
said, to codependency is boundaries. And yet, when you
Mm-hmm.
draw the boundary, everyone's like, oh, well, boundaries. And I'm like, well,
Right, yeah.
yeah.
Yeah,
So I
yeah.
guess my biggest question is, what truly is a boundary? And can people become confused by what a boundary is?
Oh my God, yeah. So before I answer what is a boundary, I tell my clients, please don't use the word boundary when you're setting boundaries with people, because there are so many myths and misconceptions about what boundaries are
Yeah.
that you don't want to say, this is my boundary. You just tell them the boundary. You
Love
don't
that.
tell them this is a boundary.
Love that.
So the way I think of boundaries, Kat, is that they are standards that you have for your life, hopefully that you live up to. So we set limits with ourselves and other people to maintain our standards. So the example I like to use, because probably everybody can identify with it, is I have some standards for my health.
Mm-hmm.
So I have limits for myself to maintain those standards. So I don't stay up past 11 p.m. I used to stay up until 3, 4 o'clock in the morning and then barely be able to get out of bed. I personally, because I'm in recovery for compulsive overeating, I plan and measure my food. I prepare most of my food myself. So I have boundaries around how much money I'm going to spend on food, and I spend money on meditation and yoga and some organic foods. I have time, I have boundaries around my time so that I'm doing things like meditating every day, twice a day, because I need that for my trauma recovery. I spend time on yoga. I spend time preparing my meals. I spend time going outside, putting my feet on the earth, being in the sunshine, feeling the air and looking at the waves and all that kind of stuff. So I have these standards for my life, and then I set limits on myself, and then I also have limits for other people. Like, I don't let people smoke in my house because I'm a healthy person. If somebody invites me to go to a buffet brunch, I will be declining that because I don't do well with buffets. And also, I eat at pretty specific times. Brunch is not something that really works for me. When somebody invites me to go to lunch for them, it's not that I never go out to eat, but I'd rather have coffee or go for a walk because I try not to do my socializing around food. So that's what I mean when I say like standard. So it's my standards, not yours. So if you want to go to a buffet, go right ahead. I'm not stopping you. You can do whatever you want. But my standard is this. And actually I'm thinking a better way to describe this would be to think about like this is my standard. So when I started building healthy boundaries, I thought that I could go to my brother's house and be like, listen, you're talking way too loud for me. It's hurting my ears. Can you quiet down? And also, I don't want to talk about politics. And I thought I would say those things and he'd be like, okay, nope, that isn't a thing. That's called trying to control other people.
Mm.
So I was like, oh, wait a minute. These are my boundaries, my standards. I don't like loud talking and I don't want to talk about politics. And so it was like, oh, they're my boundaries and my standards. So I'm the one that has to do something about it. Like he's literally incapable of talking quietly for more than 5 seconds. And he's incapable of not talking about politics. He lives and breathes politics. So if I'm the one that has those standards, then I'm the one that gets to do something about it. And so I can't turn him into a person that doesn't talk about politics and that talks quietly. It's not a thing that you turn someone into someone else. You can influence people, but you can't control them. And the way you influence them is by the dynamics of your interactions with them. With him, I was like, oh, I basically have to spend less time with him. So I stopped going as frequently and I spent less time at a time. And I started with like 90 minutes. I'm like, I'm pretty sure it's like a 59-minute window that I have with him. And now I literally haven't seen him since before the pandemic. And I can't because he's way worse than he was before. And I like emotionally, I can't handle it. Um, but I realized, these are my standards for my life. So what am I going to do about it? Now, I chose not to say to my brother, hey, if you don't start talking more quietly and if you don't stop talking about politics, then I'm not going to come around as often or for as long. I chose not to have that conversation because, truth be told, I didn't really want to be around him. And, a lot of people experience an enormous amount of guilt and shame when they start doing things like that.
That was going to be my next
Personally,
question.
well, in this particular instance, I didn't have that because I had such an enormous amount of relief of not having to be around him. What I didn't understand is that for the first 50 something years of my life, this, like, for people who aren't looking, I don't know what to tell you, but I was like, ah, like trying to fend my brother off without actually doing it. I just didn't understand. I don't have to put up with that. I do not have to be around people who jack up my nervous system all of the time that I'm with them. And to get the reward of not having to be around him, there was no guilt or shame for me in that particular instance. I've had the guilt and shame in many other instances. I think, that the number one question I get from people is, how do I set boundaries without guilt and shame? And the number two question is, what do I do when people push back? So the first, what I remember when I knew what I was doing was setting boundaries, because in the beginning I didn't know what I was doing, is I would get an email from my ex-boyfriend. So I'd be at work, I'd go into my personal email for some legitimate reason. I would see an email from him. I would feel compelled to open it immediately. I would get pissed off at him for interrupting my day when I'm the one that went into the email and chose to open it. I would read it. I would feel compelled to answer it immediately. I would give volumes of whatever. I would be pissed off and all that stuff. So what I started to understand was I don't actually have to open that email. Like I didn't know that. Like I literally did not know that it was an option to not open that email. That's a compulsion, right? That's the codependence. Well, I was like, oh my God, ex-boyfriend, he's going to think I'm a horrible person if I don't respond to his email immediately. And my stepsisters, the women I was doing the steps with, were like, he doesn't know when you get the email, Barb. Like you can respond whenever you want. It was like, oh yeah. Like, okay, again, not a dumb person, but I had to be told these things. This is how deep this stuff is that like you were talking about. So then I started being like, oh, okay, wait, I can wait until I have the psychic space to deal with this. Oh, okay. Well, eventually I got to the point where I could respond thoughtfully rather than out of like, a jacked up nervous system, and that I could respond briefly. And then I eventually got to the point where I was like, I actually don't ever have to open his emails. And it was probably a couple years before I actually realized I could block him. I didn't it just was this journey of you don't have to open it immediately. You don't have to open it immediately. You don't even have to respond after you open it or even right away. You don't have to open it and you could block it. That was probably like a 2-year journey. This is an ex-boyfriend we're talking about. Someone I did not see anymore. Someone that I left. I broke up with him, but I still felt this obligation to him. So I felt guilty and shameful. And I think this goes to the enmeshment that we were talking about before. When we start to disentangle ourselves from the people with whom we are enmeshed, it's like I'm them and they're me, and I cannot not be them, because if I do, I'm a bad person.
Mhm.
So that's like where the guilt and the shame comes in.
Mhm.
And it's more than that. There's more than that. But the way that I've learned to combat the guilt and shame, it's actually a long game. It's not something that happens like this, but it's to be centered in what matters to you. So the way that I work with my clients is I have them start by doing an exercise to come up with their top 5 values, and they keep those in the forefront of their mind. Those are their guideposts for deciding when and where to set boundaries. So we set boundaries in such a way that we support, promote, and uphold these values or these standards for our lives. And when we're anchored in that, it's so much easier to let go of the guilt and shame. So, I mentioned my health. If I say, no, I'm going to decline your invitation to this Sunday brunch buffet, and if you want to judge me for saying no because I'm protecting my health, I can live with that because my health is a top value of mine now. Where if I was just doing it willy nilly for no reason, it'd be a lot easier for me to be guilty and shameful. So it does take time, because when we start focusing on the values, what we're doing is focusing internally, and we're anchoring ourselves in ourselves, and we're anchoring ourselves in what matters to us. So when you're anchored, like think of that word anchor. When you are anchored in yourself and in what matters to you, it's a lot easier to stay stable. It's a lot harder to be like knocked off kilter. And so that's what the guilt and the shame is. We're knocked off kilter so easily. So starting to ask yourself, like, what matters to me and what do I really want and need? And in the beginning, when you ask, what do I want and need? You're not going to know because you've never paid attention to that, but you keep asking. And then once you start to figure out what you want and need, you're not going to be able to give it to yourself. Just keep asking, because then eventually you will. And then you'll start to be anchored in your own life. And so when you go to a yoga class with your partner who's on the other side of the room, you'll actually be in your body on your mat in your embodied practice and not over there with them. So that's the long game way to get rid of the guilt and shame. And then I might as well just go with the pushback, the number 2 question. So um, I encourage you to, when someone pushes back on your boundaries, to assume the best of intentions on their part. There's a whole host of reasons that people push back. One could be they forgot because you've never had boundaries before. So it's new. So they're like, oh, whoops. It could be 2. They don't believe you because you've never done this before. So they're just kind of testing you. 3 could be they have shitty boundaries. And so you need to have even stronger boundaries with people who have more boundaries. And there's a whole bunch of reasons. But if you assume the best of intentions, like you think they're doing it to you on purpose, and there are some people who are, but let's just assume it's with the best of intentions. You literally just in the beginning you just repeat yourself. So if I say to you, please don't come in without knocking, and you come in without knocking, I'm like, I maybe you didn't hear me, but I've asked you to knock before you come in. And then if they do it again, like, it seems like you're not hearing me. I've asked you to knock before you come in. And if they do it again, I would get up and I would walk them out the door, and I would say, okay, so I've told you 3 times now that I'd like you to knock on the door. So I'm going to close it, and then I want you to knock on it. Now that may sound dramatic, but there's no way that they're not going to remember. After that, if you want to get pissed off, go ahead. But like in the beginning, you're training people, retraining people how to behave with you. So we're constantly teaching people how to treat us, but most of the time we're teaching them, treat me the same as you always have. Treat me the same as you always have. Treat me the same as you always have. But when we start building boundaries with people who've been around, we're reteaching them. And so, like, think about yourself. When you're trying to change your behavior, you don't do it the first time perfectly. So, and it can be very hard in the beginning to say things calmly because you don't feel calm. I mean, no, for me, in the beginning, even when it was via email with someone I wasn't seeing. I felt inside like I was going to shit my pants. I felt like I was going to die, like my life was under threat. Like, I'm not kidding. Like, I literally had like
No.
internal
Yeah.
contraction,
Yeah.
and also feeling like, I'm going to die. I feel like my life is under threat because my life as I knew it is under threat.
Oof.
I'm no longer going to be a codependent person. So that's going to end. And so what I found helpful was in my step group, I would say, oh my God, I did the thing and I didn't die. And so we all started saying, and I didn't die, and I didn't die. And I felt like I needed to say that. I needed my intellectual part of me
Mm-hmm.
to hear that, so that eventually that would get dumped into my subconscious. So I would have a library of experiences where I didn't die from setting boundaries. So I could like record it, like this happened and I didn't die. I didn't die. I didn't die. I didn't die. And now I don't ever feel like I'm going to die when I go to set a boundary. I occasionally get like a little trickle of difficulty sometimes, but it's a trickle, not a giant waterfall of shame and guilt washing over me the way that it used to be.
Well, I think what comes up for me when you say that is just that when you figure out how to draw a boundary and do it in a way that is actually useful to you, then someone else's reaction over time of you setting that boundary then shows you if that's truly an authentic relationship or not. If you set
Mm-hmm.
the boundary 3 times and they continue squashing on the boundary, then you know that somebody else is not willing to meet you halfway
Mm-hmm.
in the kind of
Mm-hmm.
relationship that you want. And then there's the grief. And then
Mm-hmm.
there's the disappointment. And then there's the fear. And then all the things that you're talking about. And I know for
Mm-hmm.
myself, half my battle is opening my damn mouth and saying, actually, can you turn that down a little bit? Like it's really
Mm-hmm.
distracting. And then feeling
Mm-hmm.
really scared that I'm going to get rejected. And I may
Mm-hmm.
get a little like, "Ugh,
Mm-hmm.
okay. And like they'll turn it down,
Mm-hmm.
but
Mm-hmm.
it's almost like just half the battle is trying to say it in a way where you're not like, fuck you, but you're also like,
Yes,
hey,
right. Yeah.
dude,
Like,
you.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Some people are absolutely incapable of having a boundary. And it's not, like willingness isn't even part of the equation. Like that's not even on their radar because they have such poor boundaries that the idea that there should be limits or could be limits on them is just beyond them. Some of those people are in recovery, like we've met them, sometimes we were them. And so it's even more important for us to set boundaries with people like that because they're not capable. And, one thing, like once I started learning about boundaries and I started to see, like, oh, people aren't walking all over me and people aren't taking advantage of me. I'm laying on the floor and inviting them, I'm giving them advantage.
Yeah.
I started to be like, oh, this is happening. What I wasn't aware of for quite some time was that I was actually trampling over lots of other people's boundaries.
Mm.
So many times people are aware that they're getting, quote, taken advantage of. And I'm making air quotes around that because that's bullshit. We're not being taken advantage of. We're allowing that to happen. But people are aware of that part. But what they're not aware of is that they're probably trampling all over other people's boundaries.
Mm.
So unsolicited advice is a really good example. Like if you're going around telling people what they should do or sending them resources or trying to get them to do things that they don't want to do, you're not honoring other people's boundaries. Like
Mm.
it's fine to help people, but please get their consent. Like ask them, or better yet, wait until they ask for your help.
Why do codependents have trouble going back to old painful dynamics and people and environments and patterns?
So do you mean like physically going back to those places or just like in their memory?
Okay, earlier when I was talking about how like I couldn't validate for myself that I needed boundaries because this was the
Mm-hmm.
way that the family system was set up, that part
Mm-hmm.
of my brain that was blocking my ability to see that. Why do you
Mm-hmm.
think that happens with codependence so much?
I think it's the enmeshment because we're like almost literally bleeding into other people. Like I am you and you are me. I'm not different from you. I'm not like individuated. And so um, it's like fish not being able to see water kind of thing because it's what you swim in and what you live in. But I think that eventually we can. So, giving myself as an example, there was so much about my life before recovery that I was absolutely blind to. Meanwhile, I'm a deeply introspective person. I've done tons of work. I've taken almost every personal assessment out there. I've read all the books. I've been in therapy for decades, and yet there was so much I didn't know about myself. So the thing about like I'm emotional and available and I'm attracted to them, and what happens now in my current romantic relationship is still, even though we've been together for 6 years, this still happens pretty frequently. I'll be like boop, 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 beep, bopping around in my relationship with him. And I'll be like, oh my God, this would have gone completely differently in the past because I can see I'm in the situation, but I'm also observing it and going, oh yeah, this would have gone 10, completely different ways in my past relationships. So I have this ability to look back and see here's what I was doing, here's what I was thinking, and here's what my motives were back then. I was blind to all of it back then, but I have this clarity now. And in my ACA program, we talk about coming out of denial. That is a gigantic part of recovery from intergenerational family dysfunction. And so typically, when we use the word denial, we mean somebody tells you something and you're like, I deny that. I say that's not true. That's not what we're talking about here. So, denial about family dysfunction is things like, um, I think things are normal that are not. I think like it wasn't that bad when it was traumatizing. I say, I'm fine. And I kind of believe that I'm fine, but there's no way that I'm fine. And everybody around me is like, you're totally not fine. We start to put things together that we never saw as being related before. So, like, what pops into my mind to share for that is my dad was a pharmacist. Well, his mom was a hypochondriac.
Wow.
Until I was in my 50s in recovery, I never put that together. He
Wow.
became a fucking pharmacist to cure his mother.
Hmm.
Like, how did I not see that? It was like, oh my God. You know, I thought when I was in high school that I was cool and that's why I smoked weed. Now I'm like, oh my God, I smoked weed because I had trauma and I needed to regulate my nervous system. I needed to dissociate from reality. You know, when I got into ACA, when I started, the meeting that I was in, some of the people in that room had been like brutalized as children. I wasn't. I was not brutalized. It was very clear. Objectively, I did not have it as bad as the people in the room. So the first 6 months, I was like, okay, I know I have the traits. I didn't know how I got them.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was 17, and again when I was 18, my dad tried to strangle me. And I knew that that was traumatic, but I didn't know that it was trauma. And I was almost an adult. So did that really count? Like I somehow didn't think that that counted. Right. And then about 6 months in, I got the message that trauma can result from the absence of good things happening. And I was
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, that's me. I started to hear more and more of what I didn't get because I knew, like, I grew up in a house. We always had food. We lived in a yard. We had a car. We never went without food. My parents always had jobs. They didn't tell me that I was a piece of shit that would never amount to anything. Right. And I was like, okay, how do I have these traits? Well, the absence of good things. I later heard it said trauma can result from unmet needs. Well, my primary unmet needs were emotional and psychological. We weren't allowed to have feelings in our house. The way we communicated was with things like sarcasm and teasing and shame. Like I had to learn as an adult, like shaming and teasing people. The reason it feels like shit is because it's shitty.
Mm-hmm.
It's like it's not funny.
Yeah.
It's not loving. Yes, I can take a joke, but that's not a joke. And there's nothing wrong with me for feeling like it's shitty. So coming out of denial is starting to see like that was mean. That didn't feel good. You don't get to talk to me that way. Um, this isn't normal. I don't have to put up with this. Just because you've been told something your entire life doesn't mean it's true. You know, um, I knew starting when I was probably about 10 that my dad like cheated on my mom. I don't know if it was flings, relationships, mistresses, but I knew, well, if I'm 10 and I know, there's no way my mother doesn't know, right? So we all know dad is cheating on mom, but we're not talking about it. So that's another form of denial. So this denial, like the way that the literature in ACA says, is denial is the glue that holds dysfunctional families together. So what that means is nobody would purposely ever pass down family dysfunction. We have to be in denial to pass it down. We think, oh, I'm doing better than my parents, and maybe you are, but it's not good. Or I'm doing this because I love you. No, we don't hit people because we love them. We hug people because we love them.
Yeah.
We are affectionate and caring
Yeah.
and gentle and nurturing with people that we love. We don't harm people. That's not love.
Yeah.
That's dysfunction. So denial is huge. I think I have like 6 or 7 episodes about denial on my podcast. And the reason I have so many is because every time a new layer of denial comes off, I do a podcast episode to be like, oh, wait, here's some more.
It's ever evolving. I think people think they're going to go into family generational trauma work or boundaries work or therapy, and they're going to do 3 sessions and it's going to be like, okay, done. I'm done. I did all the, it's like, no, like, my sessions are 2 hours long for a reason. It's the way I prefer to do things. And we do so much in those 2 hours. And sometimes people have expectations like, well, everything should be healed if we're doing a 2-hour session. And I'm thinking, honey, we just scratched the surface. Like we just uncovered one layer. And I think that you bring up another thing about validation, which is how beautiful that you are providing that validation for people who have that complex trauma and need the validation that their reality in their lives in that moment is because of all these small events that have happened over a long period of time where everyone was in denial and invalidating their experiences and not sitting with them and telling them this is what sadness looks like, this is what anger looks like, this is what it's like to have boundaries, because all those things go against the enmeshment of the family system.
Yeah.
We were talking a little bit earlier about your beautiful, healthy relationship that you're in. And I wanted to circle back on this. In all the work that you've done, what have you discovered are some of the most important character traits or even values that someone can have in going into wanting to create a healthy relationship of any kind?
I don't really think it's so much about any particular values. I think it's being anchored in yourself and knowing who you are and what's okay with you and not okay with you, and then communicating it to that person. So one of the things that attracted me to my sweetheart initially was that he had really good boundaries. And that was like, ooh, this is really safe, because when you have good boundaries, I don't need to take care of you because you're taking care of yourself. And then the other thing, I think, like to me, the most important key to our relationship is that as soon as something comes up that bothers either one of us, we say it immediately. We don't let it fester. We don't beat around the bush. We just say, hey, that didn't work for me, or I have an upset, or I have a concern, or when you said that like that, that was really not typical for you, or is everything okay, because that's not normally how you talk to me. Like we just deal with things so we don't have fights. Like the most difficult week of my relationship with him, which now I can't remember if it was 2 years ago or 3 years ago, we were away on a vacation. We went to Letchworth State Park in upstate New York. It's called the Grand Canyon of the East. And we were in a cabin, and they have these built-in bunks that you can't move. And so we're used to sleeping together. So we built this thing with all these other mattresses, and it was this crappy situation. It was raining the whole first week. He has health issues. And it was just, we were just really, really triggered at both of us, right? And so I, at one point, basically turned him into my dad. And then at one point, he was like, I feel like I'm 12 years old, and he'd never talked like that before. And so even though it was the most difficult week of my relationship with him, we still had a great time. And then after we got home, I said to him, listen, I'd like us to set aside maybe 30 minutes tonight to process what happened when we were on vacation. If we get to the end of that 30 minutes and we're not done, we'll put a pin in it so that we can go on with our wonderful evening together. I've never spoken like that in my life, Kat. I just know, like, I got to put a boundary around that. I like this tells him we're going to have a conversation, not a confrontation. There's going to be an end to it. And I want to get to the part of us being like sweethearts, not just, and we ended up being able to process everything we needed to process. And we both apologized to each other within that 30 minutes, but it doesn't always happen that way. Like, I didn't know how to act in relationships before. I didn't know, but I essentially blamed my partners for everything. This is what I was saying before. Like, they're responsible for all the bad things. If they would just change, then everything would be okay. But, that's not how it works. Like, the one thing that I was able to own in my previous relationships, like, I came to see I'm the common denominator, but that's as far as it went. I didn't know what that meant.
Right.
I knew I've had this long series of dysfunctional relationships, but I didn't know how I got them. And recovery got me to be able to see my patterns and how I got them. And then I think everybody says the key to a healthy relationship is healthy communication. But if you don't know who you are, you don't know what to communicate. If you don't know what's okay with you and what's not okay with you, what are you communicating to them? You're going, yeah, okay, sure, that's fine. I'm fine. Oh, whatever you want. Yeah, that's fine with me. Go ahead.
Yeah, we continue to give up ourselves in order to get love. I heard from a woman named Susie Tucker, who is a teacher in the family constellation therapy world, that what we say to others in judgment or in criticism or in harshness, we're actually needing to say to our parents. So if we criticize another, we're actually just mirroring exactly what our internal experience is. So many times if, our parents or our partners say, well, you should have tried harder or figure it out, that oftentimes is reflecting within us maybe, something that they need to say to their parents or a boundary they need to set, but they're not sure how. So they then direct it towards us. If we are struggling to learn how to create boundaries for ourselves and someone attempts to draw a boundary with us and it triggers us, what is the healthiest way to respond to that as somebody who's cultivating that within ourselves?
So it really depends on who the other person is, because if they're a healthy person, you're going to respond one way. And if they're an unhealthy person, you're probably going to respond another way. So if it was somebody that I was in recovery with and that was on the journey with me, I'd be like, I'm feeling really triggered right now, so I need a moment. I would just be boldly honest, right? But if it was somebody who was like a toxic person or just like a normie, I would be like, I need a moment. I wouldn't necessarily tell them why, but I think pausing is one of them. This is my number one tool of recovery. When I first learned that you could pause, it was like, great idea. No idea how to do it.
Yeah.
And for me, learning to pause was like climbing Mount Everest, but I eventually did learn how to pause. And so just giving yourself a moment, because when you're triggered, that means you're in the fight or flight mode, which means you can't think clearly because you can't access your frontal lobe. And the way to get out of that is to ground yourself and be in the present moment. I heard somebody say recently, occupy your feet, occupy your body. And I'm like, I can literally feel that as I say that. It's not the same as being occupy your body. So be here, whatever get your breathing set so that your body knows that you're safe, so that you can actually think. But if it's like an emergency situation, for me, hand signals are really good. Like you're putting up a physical barrier, like stop, don't do that. You're also energetically pushing their energy away when you do that. But I think it really depends on the situation. But if you're new at boundaries and you're triggered, you're probably not going to be able to do it. I mean, that's just the reality of the situation. And it's important to know, like, you're going to make mistakes with boundaries in the beginning. Like, one of the things I say to my clients is there's a quote that a lot of our parents say, oh, if there's anything worth doing is worth doing badly at first, where most of us were told anything worth doing is worth doing right. That might be so, but it's worth doing badly at first. Like, you have to be willing to mess up with boundaries, because boundary building is an experimental process. Like you can't just decide, here's my boundary, and then be able to do it. You have to, like most of us don't even know what our boundaries are because we've never had them. So when I started setting boundaries, I didn't know it was what I was doing. But one of the first boundaries I remember setting, and I don't remember what it was, but this was me. Wham! Ooh, way too harsh. That was way too harsh. Now, Kat, if I had known that it was going to be too harsh, that's not the boundary I would have set.
Right.
I only knew because of how it felt to me. Now, if I wasn't willing to do something badly at first, I wouldn't be a boundaries coach now, and I wouldn't have helped the like hundreds of people that I've helped. And so I was like, ooh, that didn't work. How do I want to adjust to that in a way that feels more authentic to who I am? But in the beginning, you don't know what your limits are because you've never had them before. And so you have to experiment.
Yeah, I like that. That kind of gives you grace in the process a little bit, giving yourself a bit of compassion and letting yourself be imperfect rather and figure it out as
Right.
you go.
Yeah.
And I guess my really last question is something that I've thought about for years. I didn't know about any of this stuff until my uncle started sharing the idea of boundaries with me. And he was kind of telling me about what the inner child was for the first time. And he was doing this great work. And I was like, wow, this is so cool. I'm so interested. But he said something to me that has always stuck with me. And he said, a lot of people mistake boundaries for walls. What are the differences between boundaries and walls?
So boundaries are flexible, but if you have a violent person in your life, you need a wall.
Right.
Right? So it's a stronger boundary. Like, okay, one time I was working part-time at a co-working place, and they basically wanted me to check my emails for their organization when I wasn't working. And I was like, that's not happening. Like I have two part-time jobs and my own business. Like, so do you want me to answer those emails while I'm on your, and the owner called it my firewall. Not just a regular boundary, but a firewall. And I was like, and I think he thought he was insulting me. I was like, I have a firewall. Oh my God, I'm so excited. Like, I have an impermeable boundary here.
Yeah.
Like, years ago, I would never have been able to have that conversation with him. I would have caved in a second, but I was like, no, this is a 10-hour-a-week part-time job. I'm not answering my emails outside of the time I'm being paid.
Yeah.
It's not happening.
Yeah.
Like, no, so firewall, maybe that isn't the right term for that. But like, if you have a violent person in your life, you need a firewall with them. Like, this is what restraining orders are, firewalls, right? So walls are very, very, very firm boundaries. Most boundaries, so the metaphor that I use is having a healthy boundary is like having a fence with a gate in it. And the gate only opens from the inside. You're the gatekeeper, you're inside. And so what that means, if someone is on your quote property, so the metaphor is that you're your property, you have a fence around it, the fence is the boundary, and you're the manager of the property. So if someone is trampling on your property, they didn't jump the fence, you open the door and let them in. So it's your job to shepherd them out and close it. Now, there's all kinds of fences. There's all kinds of gates. You could have a really high fence. You could have one that people could jump over. You could have one that electrocutes people if they touch it, So you get to decide, like, what kind of a boundary am I going to have? And the boundary you have with any specific person could vary based on your level of energy or what's going on with you in your life. Like, if you're going through a really depressive episode, you might be like, I got to have really strict boundaries right now because I can't deal with it. Or you might be like, I can't handle having boundaries right now because I don't have the energy. Like, it just depends on the person. And, your level of energy has a lot to do with what kind of boundaries you have. It's easier to uphold them when you have better energy. But when you're not in good energy, you probably need them more, but like for me, I have such solid boundaries now that it doesn't even matter when I'm in low energy. I still have solid boundaries because, there's this thing that happens, Kat. I don't know how to explain it. Where this happened to me, it's happened to my clients, it's happened to my fellows in recovery. So I know that it's not just me. It's almost like this energetic force field not erupts, but like evolves around us, whereby other people's stuff doesn't penetrate us, doesn't penetrate our energetic field. so that when I used to feel other people's feelings, I don't feel them anymore. I feel badly for people, but I'm not crying and hurt because it's not happening to me. And I know that. So I don't understand how this works, but I also don't understand how the wind works. I don't understand how electricity works. I just know that they're real
Yeah.
and they have effects that I can see, just like this boundary. So, I think the reason that, because I live this stuff. So I don't just have good boundaries myself, but I teach it every day. So of course I have good boundaries. So when I'm like depressive, my energetic force field is still in place,
Mm.
you know?
Well, it just kind of opens up more of the conversation of the fact that 80% of women in the US struggle with autoimmune conditions. And I think there's so much to be said for women giving away their energy in this very
Mm,
traditional role that
mm-hmm,
women have been put
mm-hmm,
in by family and
mm-hmm,
society and expectations
mm-hmm,
and whatever it
mm-hmm,
is,
mm-hmm,
where we are expected to give ourselves away without
mm-hmm,
any sovereignty of our choices, without honoring
mm-hmm,
our boundaries, without
mm-hmm,
diving into our
mm-hmm,
emotions.
mm-hmm,
And I just think that more women, I hope that more women, myself included, come to live in a world where we are celebrated for our choices, we are celebrated for
mm-hmm,
our
mm-hmm,
boundaries, and we are
mm-hmm,
not violated many times
mm-hmm,
at the
mm-hmm,
hands of other people who can't
mm-hmm,
respect those. Because true love, in my opinion, is when respect is given both ways, even if it's not always
mm-hmm,
understood.
mm-hmm. Yeah. There's a couple of things I'd like to say about what you said. One is, my ideal client is a professional woman who says yes when she really wants to say no and who neglects herself because she's so focused on others.
Yeah.
Well, here's the thing. Women are never going to make the inroads into the social structures of society when they keep saying yes to shit they don't want to do and when they keep
Amen.
neglecting themselves. So
Amen.
yes, patriarchy exists
Yeah.
and the social structure is not by and for women, but we can weaken and disrupt the social structures at the individual micro level between each other. But we're not going to do it when we're taking on everybody else's stuff and when we're neglecting ourselves.
Yeah.
So there's that. And then one of the reasons that we do all that stuff is because one of the worst things you can say to a woman is you're selfish. So I had a client who said to me, I'd rather be called a whore than selfish. Like, what the fuck is going on in this world that a woman would rather be called a whore than selfish?
Yeah.
Like, really?
Yeah.
And it's selfish is used as almost like an epithet to a woman. It's like you put her in her place.
Yeah.
I don't believe I've ever heard of a man giving a shit if someone called him selfish or even someone calling a man selfish. Like, if you're worried about becoming selfish, you are never going to be selfish, okay? Because selfish people don't worry about that. And taking care of yourself is not selfish, it's self preservation and it's also selfless. So, I don't know if you've ever heard of Ashley Kirkwood. She wrote the book Speak Your Way to Cash.
Mm-mm.
She says, don't pour from an empty cup, pour from the overflow. Well, the only way you can have overflow is if you fill your cup first.
Yeah.
And I love this notion. So you're not even pouring from the cup is still full, you're pouring from the overflow. And then I heard someone else say, pour from the saucer. Like, oh, there's so much overflowing that you've got it in the saucer to pour from, right? So who would you rather receive from, Kat? Somebody who's trying to squeeze something out of an empty cup or someone that is generously giving from the overflow?
Mm.
And then when you neglect yourself and you run yourself ragged and pour from an empty cup, you're teaching everybody around you to treat you that way. And if you're a mom, you're teaching your children, especially your daughters, I'm expendable. And when you grow up, you will be expendable too. So we have to take matters into our own hands
Mm.
and stop with the overgiving and stop with the over accommodating other people. And I think a lot of people aren't able to have boundaries because they don't feel good about themselves. And I always thought of myself as a powerful woman of agency. I thought of myself as having high self esteem.
Mm.
Well, recovery taught me I didn't love myself. I didn't have self worth. I knew I didn't trust myself. That I did know. And it was the boundary building process that got me to really know myself, got me to love myself, got me to feel worthy, and built self trust.
Wow.
So, those are some of the 7 gajillion reasons why I became a boundaries coach, because I want that for other women, because I see it everywhere. Like I looked on the outside like I had it together. And in many respects I did.
Mm.
But obviously, from all the things I've told you, which have been a fraction of the things,
Yeah.
I was a mess.
Barb, you are so incredibly inspiring. I want to work with you. I'm not joking.
Oh,
I want to
goody.
work with you. I'm like, because you know what? I think with like, again, I'm going to go back to what I said earlier. A lot of women who struggle with boundaries, I think, struggle with feeling validated in the ability to make those boundaries. Because for me, when I draw a boundary, I am shaking when I set that boundary because I am
Mm-hmm.
so scared of what's on the other side of that. And most of the
Mm-hmm.
time it's a bark. It's a bark. Like the bark is louder than the bite. It's not that big of a deal. Like you said, when I have boundaries, I teach others how to treat me, but it's that fear that if I just say how I feel, that I'm going to
Mm-hmm.
be rejected, abandoned, neglected, pushed away, out,
Mm-hmm.
ostracized, or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
your story is incredibly inspiring, and I cannot thank you enough for. I feel like I went through a coaching session for the last hour and 10
Awesome.
minutes,
Oh, I'm so
and
glad.
I
And we
really
didn't even talk about inner children and inner family work or anything like that.
but you know what? I think people will be thinking about that based on what you're
Mm-hmm.
saying because the whole time I'm sitting here
Mm-hmm.
trying to be so present, but my mind is like,
Mm-hmm.
wait, oh my God, she's making this more clear for me. And this is, so I really cannot thank you enough for your wisdom. And I say this from woman to woman. Thank you for being such a wonderful example for another woman like me who is trying to learn to feel sovereign in her boundaries.
Excellent.
It's people like you who make me feel
Mm-hmm.
that I can reach that place because it's out there and you're showing us that it's possible. So thank you.
Love it. And it's my absolute pleasure. I mean, this is a mission for me. This is not a job.
Yeah.
This is a mission. What I really want is for 8 billion people to be individuated and have their own healthy boundaries.
Yeah.
Can you imagine if everybody was like living their own life and not so focused on what other people are doing or not doing and thinking and all that? I do have one last thought because you
Yeah.
mentioned the word abandoned.
Yes.
Just then so this is the legacy of adult children. So the thing we fear the most is abandonment, typically emotional abandonment, though many adult children were physically abandoned. And ironically, the thing we do to ourselves is abandon ourselves.
Mm.
And so what I found, Kat, is that when I stopped abandoning myself, I stopped being so afraid of abandonment, which makes sense because when you abandon yourself and you're in a relationship with someone else, you've built abandonment into the relationship
Mm.
because you're not really there, because you're pretending that you're someone that you're not. You've abandoned yourself. So when you stop abandoning yourself, you at least have you. And then if you have a higher power like I do, I'm like doubly not abandoned because I have a higher power and I have me.
Yeah.
So I want your approval, but I don't need like with claws your approval the way that I used to because I really approve of me because I am an honest woman of integrity now who shows up for herself and follows through for herself and doesn't abandon herself. And so I'm going to be okay. I don't want you to leave, but if you leave, I'm going to be okay. And I know it.
Wow. Yeah, it's that generational pattern of abandonment that shows up in so many different ways that we think that's what love and connection or belonging is everyone belongs through abandonment. But again,
Mm-hmm.
it's that ability to step outside of the circle and go, actually, I'm going to try something different. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work, but it usually works. And then feeling like you get to create a life that feels really good for you, mind, body, and spirit too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
Barb, thank you so much for your time
Oh,
today.
my pleasure. My
And
pleasure.
if people want to work with you and if people are really just motivated and inspired by the words you've said today, like myself, how can they find
Mm-hmm.
you and connect with you?
So, if they think that they might want to do coaching with me, I do a free 30-minute Better Boundaries call, and you can just go to barbchat.net and just that's a link to my calendar. You can sign up for that. If you want to dip your toes in, I offer a free boundary building starter kit. If you go to boundariesstarterkit.com, you will find it. It takes you to the homepage of my website. And then if you're already listening to this podcast, you can just hop on over to mine, which is Fragmented to Whole, or you can go to fragmentedtowhole.com.
Okay, beautiful. Yeah, I'm going to check it out myself too. Good
Excellent.
information. Barb, thank you so much for being on the Heal with Kat podcast.
Oh, thank you, Kat. This was a fantastic conversation. I can't
Oh,
even believe it's been over an hour.
I know, it went so quickly.